Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks!
Hi, this is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week we have Bridget Reiser on the phone, and you may hear the last name Reiser and think, well, didn't you already have a guest with that name? And yes, we did. We had her older brother, Mike, who I met in college at the University of Pittsburgh, but I've actually known Bridget and consider her my own friend for at least a decade now. She is a licensed professional counselor who treats anxiety and depression across the lifespan. She got her bachelor's degree in film, and after bartending for a few years and watching The Cell one too many times, she went back for a master's in counseling and started a professional counseling career. However, that happened just as the pandemic came on, when they changed a lot of the field that she had trained for. So she still has her job, and she's doing a great job, but she obviously had to adjust to all that. And bottom line is that she loves helping people untangle their relationships and doing dream analysis. So we'll get into all that and more. Welcome to the show, Bridget.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was so happy to see you at your brother's wedding. Also, we had his wife on the show, so it's all family here on Coffin Talk.
Very nice.
And we have a standard 3 questions that we ask every guest at the beginning of the show, which is, how old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
So I'm 33. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I am definitely a millennial. I think I'm right in the middle of that one.
All right. And do you like the term millennial? I'm just curious.
I do. I identify with, sort of what I see as the ethos of millennials.
Awesome. That's really cool. And because you're a counselor and because you just used the word ethos, I'm going to make you explain to our audience what you meant by that.
So I think what I mean by that is sort of the public perception of like who and what millennials are versus kind of the millennials I know and the values we ascribe to more so as a group, right? So this disconnect between millennials being talked about a lot in the media as being young, kind of irresponsible and adrift. We're not that young at this point. And we're very, very hardworking, kind of doing our best to stay afloat in a pretty unforgiving economy without getting, I don't think, too demoralized as a whole.
I think that was fantastically accurate. I am considered by some an elder millennial, which is like a hilarious term, but
Sure.
I identify more just by a hair, like with a generation ahead of that one, but I kind of identify with neither. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that I think millennials work too hard. That's actually my biggest critique of, quote, that your or our generation. And so it's funny because, yeah, like I've heard the media like say like these blah, 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 but I'm not noticing that. And then also I've had a couple Gen Z guests on purpose to try to also show that they're not like, quote unquote, this like lazy, But how much of that do you think has to do with like aging? Like, do you think we just like start labeling people when they're 18 and then we're kind of unforgiving about that?
That's such a good question. I don't know. I think it shifts, with age for each generation, right? Like there is sort of this weirdly built-in animosity. Like even if I guess you're an exception, but if you look at how kind of millennials and Gen X talk about like Gen Z, who's not that much younger, it's with a lot of derision a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It does seem to be kind of an inherent part of like this aging dynamic.
Yeah, and I've always found it like fascinating because I have tons of friends my own age. I have less friends like much younger than me, but enough. And then I have so many friends who are older than me, and I've always enjoyed like talking about life with people who aren't in the exact same position as me. So yeah, the Gen Z thing, it's hard because I will say this to any Gen Z person face to face, I do notice that customer service and interaction with Gen Z is radically different. I'm not saying it's worse, but it's not at all what I'm accustomed to. I don't know if you've noticed that at all.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the socialization has just been different, and I guess that feels, if it's unfamiliar, it feels negative, but I don't know that it necessarily is.
Yeah, well, you just used my favorite buzzword and Alana's least favorite buzzword, which is socialization, because as we raise a kid together and as I just like constantly think about my life and where things went, huge air quotes, wrong. For
Mhm.
me, it's like I never blame my parents, and I never blame like particular people. I just always throw all my blame at socialization. So I'd love to ask you, since your career is in like analyzing this kind of stuff, like just kind of what do you feel about socialization, just to start as like an easy kind of topic.
Oh, that's an easy topic.
Well, I just meant like you don't have to. I'm not going to ask like the most specific question I have.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, it's complex, right? Because if you think about, so it sounds like you're separating a little bit sort of individual parenting choices from the idea of like a larger socialization, but I think they're very interconnected, right? Because parents are also socialized within a specific, cultural context. So kind of parsing those things out is I think really challenging.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, the reason it comes up so often with Alana, my wife, and I, is that I feel guilty when I tell my daughter, like, you can't wear that. That's, like, not appropriate. Because, like, in my opinion, I'm like, that's fake. Like, you should be able to wear anything you want. You don't need to cut your hair. You know, like, I know my list of, like, shoulds for society reason versus, like, how I actually feel. And that's, like, always the divide is I'm like, well, we do want to bring on an airplane and like take flights with her, so I can't just be like, be you, scream whenever you feel like it, you know?
Yeah. No, yeah, that's such a good point because you're right. I think there is a lot of emphasis right now in terms of, I guess, parenting and just in general about being yourself, not being afraid to be individual in ways that are sort of safe and not necessarily harmful to anyone else. But the other side of that coin is that we do live in a society, right? So there are always going to be kind of rules and expectations. And if you're not adhering to them, you're going to have trouble navigating it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, because it started with like talking about generations and Gen Z. What I noticed too is that like COVID hit right when Gen Z was air quote like graduating, like meaning like obviously it's more of a
Yeah.
10-year span thing, but like the average Gen Zer was like about to like go into like high school or go into the workforce, and like COVID froze socialization like really weirdly. And kind of just to stay on topic, but to make it about you, how was COVID for you? Because you mentioned it in your bio.
Yeah. So, I mean, COVID for me it was interesting, right? It was challenging, of course, but my experience was that I was just starting my new career in mental health. Um, I started in 2020, so or maybe like right, I think like December of 2019, right? So I had been doing therapy in person for just a couple months before everything changed about everything. So the way that we were doing therapy, we switched to virtual. I luckily was able to hang on to my job. You know, a lot of people had a tough time with that in the mental health field, especially like a lot of people in smaller agencies or private practice were very challenged by having to make the switch to virtual. The company that I was with at the time did that fairly efficiently, although we were doing group therapy over screens, which
Oh
was
wow,
bizarre.
yeah.
Yeah, right. So I learned how to do group therapy, which is complicated, in a group of people sitting in a room together. And then basically, as soon as I sort of got the hang of that, the whole rule book went out for how to facilitate a group. So that was that was very strange. And also, working in, I guess I should mention the program that I was working at was a high level of care. So partial hospitalization program, basically it's every day of the week. It's right below residential or like hospitalization would be in terms of psychiatric illnesses. So, people who had very acute symptoms of mental illness now having to face being completely socially isolated, being stressed out about, a disease that had no vaccine or cure for quite a while. Sort of all of the things that might, elevate somebody's anxiety and depression were hitting this population at the same time as hitting all of the therapists working with this population, right? So it was a bizarre experience of having to go home every day. I lived alone. Go home every day, kind of not see anyone, not do anything, doing all the pandemic things that everybody else was doing. and then coming back to work the next day, kind of having people ask me for answers or for comfort, and being in like a really similar boat to a lot of people.
Wow, that was so interesting, and I have so many like tangential questions, but I'm gonna keep it focused and ask you about mental health because I'm constantly wondering this, and I know there's no real answer, and I also know it's almost like a chicken versus the egg kind of thing. But do you think there's been a rise in mental illness, or do you think there's been a rise in awareness of mental health and discussion and naming of things as illness and stuff like that? I mean, I'm sure it's a little column A and a column B, but if you had to pick, or can you pick, do you believe one is happening more than the other?
For sure, I would endorse the column A, column B answer. I do think there's been a genuine uptick in mental illness and in symptoms of mental illness, sort of in people across the board.
And like, do you think in like the last 20 years, 30 years, 100 years?
Oh, I mean, definitely in the last like 5 years or
Okay,
so.
yeah.
So COVID for sure is kind of its own entity in terms of what it's done to people's mental health. But I'm also, very much on the social media as a detriment to mental health bandwagon, and that's been going on for a little while as well. So, I mean, I think those are two big factors for sure.
Yeah, and like, I mean, it was fun because like when I saw you at your brother's wedding, we got to talk like a lot more than I got to talk to a lot of other people, which was awesome. So I feel bad because I know I asked you some of these questions, and I knew at the time I was like, well, I'm gonna end up re-asking these, but I am curious, like, what is it like to be a human, and then like to some people, you're like a god to them, like you're like you can help them, you have like this warm, compassionate heart and all that, but then like a lot of people get reliant on that. And so I've always wondered this as someone who hasn't had a lot of experience in therapy, like when do you know to like cut the cord with the client? Like, hey, this is like, I wish I was helping you, but I'm not. You're just like using me for support.
Well, I mean, to some extent, therapy is using someone for support. So that's not necessarily, unhealthy at baseline. I think for me, my approach to therapy sets myself and my clients up for pretty firm boundaries and for not running into kind of a dependent dynamic as often. I mean, it happens, right? It'll happen with anyone. But I utilize kind of a like a little more of an old school, like less in vogue approach these days, which is the idea of like the blank screen from psychoanalysis. So not as hardcore as, not saying anything during session, but I'm really careful about sort of redirecting every challenge to kind of like coming from the person themselves in terms of the answer, right? So I'm very upfront about like, I don't give advice. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'll help you weigh the pros and cons, but you're going to come up with the answer. And I also don't disclose much personal information at all. So yeah, I think that approach makes it less likely that people are going to kind of look to me for answers. They look to me for a lot of comfort and for a lot of help kind of taking down their own barriers to finding those answers. But they kind of know from the outset that I'm never going to tell them like, hey, here's what this is and here's what you should do.
Cool. That's really cool. That's an interesting answer. And I'm like always just interested in all this stuff because to me, like, okay, I believe health care should be universal. I don't think it should be free because that's like a silly way to look at it. I just think no matter what, all people should have access to healthcare because if you were in a tribe, of course you would help one of your tribe's men or women like if they got sick. So why, when we're like a nation, quote unquote tribe, do we not do the same? So with all that said, and that's more for my audience than you, I feel like mental health counts and like this should also be very accessible and especially for disenfranchised people who don't have high income streams and lots of free time. So I feel like we're at this like enormous crux in not only the American society but in the world with like how do we address like all of this. So I'm curious, like because what you said was really accurate in my opinion, which is like, of course they're using you, but that's kind of the point. Like, people need help. People need someone to bounce ideas off to see if they're crazy. Like, so do you hope that we'll get a better system where like every person could have a personal therapist, or do you think that's not at all like realistic, nor is it really a solution?
Well, I do hope that we'll get a better system at some point than we have in place right now. There are a lot of service gaps, especially at kind of those higher levels of acuity. We are, systemically not very good at handling suicidal ideation, and things, the kind of like really severe self-harm, things like that. In terms of the idea of, everybody having access to, I guess, just talk therapy, I think that would be great. I don't know that everyone would need it necessarily, or need it more than sort of periodically, but it's for sure not gonna do any harm to people. I wouldn't imagine.
Cool. Yeah. I want to link this, and I've been heading here to like spirituality. So I kind of want to like freeze this conversation and then ask you, not only what your sense of spirituality, if any, is, but like, how did that change over the course of your life? And then I want to ask you, what do you think happens when you die? So you can kind of answer all that in one question, or I can ask them one by one.
Hey everyone, after more than 15 years in the business, I finally got a book published. If you want to do me the biggest favor in the whole world, please head over to MikeyOpp.com and buy a copy. That's MikeyOpp.com, and the book is named Martyr, and it's about psychics and the history and future of the universe. I wrote it, and I think you'll love it.
Sure. So I was raised Catholic by very devout Catholic parents. And so that was, what shaped my spirituality in like a very holistic way. I went to Catholic school. We went to church every Sunday, like very, very much practicing. And over the course of my life, as I got a little older, into like late teens, kind of college age, I started to have a lot of problems with just the Catholic Church as an institution. And kind of went back and forth on that whole thing. But I guess kind of nowadays I would consider myself to be Catholic, but to be sort of a lapsed or non-practicing, I guess, Catholic. So the whole belief system I still subscribe to. It still guides my day-to-day life, but I don't love the patriarchal church itself, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I've actually I've never heard that answer on this podcast, and I've only heard it twice, and oddly enough from men. That's really interesting. So do you believe then in heaven and hell?
Yeah.
And so you said that like it drives you, like that's your kind of governing. So do you find comfort in the idea that you're going to go to heaven? I'm assuming you think you're going to go to heaven.
I mean, it changes day by day, right? But I mean, that's my hope. I think I'm doing well enough that would be the more likely outcome. Although, with Catholics, it kind of depends on which priest you ask,
yeah.
But, how well you're doing. But, yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me talking, as part of my job with a lot of different people with different belief systems and walks of life, and dealing pretty explicitly with death, or with the fear of death, right? So kind of thinking about that comfort piece of the question, I think it's so comforting to believe in an afterlife. And for me, that part of like the Catholic faith never really wavered. So there's never been a point in my life where I've been really afraid of death per se. Like obviously not knowing when or how is kind of scary when you start to think about it. But like just the reality of having to die at some point doesn't actually cause me dread when I think about it, which is different from a lot of people that I talk to.
That's kind of why I started the podcast. Was I was shocked by how few Americans, I'm going to keep it really local, enjoy or like will even partake in a conversation about death when it's like off the cuff and like random. So in other words, like it's okay at like someone's grandmother dies and you say like, my condolences, and then they might like give a little quip of like their philosophy, but that's like the only time it's okay. And so it's funny because the sense of dread is what I'm trying to combat, but I'm not trying to combat it by like telling people this is what happens. I'm just trying to get people to think the same way you do, which is like, well, how can I create a life system and belief system and governance system of the universe that provides me with the best system for me to be my best and feel my best? And I was just thinking yesterday, I was like chopping vegetables for dinner, about how hilarious it is that like I need to believe in an afterlife and a before life. Otherwise, I really have trouble putting up with a lot of like the crap that I do put up with. And I was just thinking about how that's funny that that's like my main reason. It's not about dread of dying. It's not about like fears. It's about like when I get upset that the world has a lot of greed, or like this or that has happened to other people, or that this just happened to me. It's so easy for me to just be like, well, you're here to learn lessons.
That's so true. Yeah. I feel that.
Yeah. And so with you, like, because I've never ever believed in heaven because it wasn't introduced to me. That's the reason. It's because like I grew up quasi-Jewish. My parents like taught me certain prayers and we did certain rituals, but they never talked about like Jews believe in an afterlife. Jews don't believe, that was just never talked about. So as I got older, of course, my brother like majored in religious studies and I would like learn things, and my wife's parents are both Orthodox Jews. So now I know like so much about Jewish beliefs that it's like hilarious, but I did not grow up with those and I didn't grow up investing in them. But like I can tell you, I was jealous with like the biggest capital J ever of all my friends who believed in heaven, because it sounds amazing. So I'm curious, like the flip side of that for me, the reason I was okay with not believing in heaven is I was like, well, at least I'm not scared of hell. So I want to ask you just directly, when you said, well, I'd like to think I'm going there, like in your darker days or moments when you actually start to think like, what if I go to hell? What does that do to you?
Yeah, so that's where the whole Catholic guilt thing that's really famous comes in. It feels bad. It feels really bad. And I've had, when I was growing up and sort of more steeped in that community, different priests adhering to sort of different levels of rigidity about the rules, right? So, a formative experience for me was that throughout my high school days, when I was super involved in church activities and going to church and all of it, the priest that we had at the time at our church was like a very hellfire priest. He said that if like there's no such thing as mortal sins or venial sins, which like just for people who aren't familiar is basically mortal sins are really bad, murder, you go straight to hell. Venial sins are, telling a lie, things that are not good, but probably not going to damn your soul. So like not going to church on a Sunday, mortal sin, right? You can't take communion anymore if you didn't come last week. So yeah, so I have done some thinking, right, about like along those lines of, I must be a terrible person by certain standards. And I've had to actively, I guess, redefine some of those rules for myself. Spend a lot of time thinking about like my own moral compass and how it fits in. Yeah, it's hard.
I mean, that was a great answer, and that was what I was not hoping to hear, but that does help answer some of my question. And I guess the only other side question I want to ask you is like, how do you sell yourself on a concept of God when you know that God, depending on which priest you ask, would want you to be, like feel guilt and fear and feel bad and like scared? Like, how do you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, my personal answer to that would just be that priests are as fallible as anybody else, right? So looking at priests as the authorities on all of this is sort of why like the whole church structure doesn't really work for me that well, because they have different ideas, right? So having a general consensus and having people kind of talk and debate about it, which is what the clergy does, I think is helpful. But I think ultimately with any religion, you got to kind of pick and choose what works for you and what really makes sense to you, and just subscribe to those parts.
Yeah, and that's what I've never been an atheist, nor have I ever been a like religion hater. But when I have periods of like, this is so frustrating. If this religion didn't exist, these people wouldn't have this opinion, and then they wouldn't like. The one of the things I sell myself on is like the average person actually it totally benefits from having religion in their life. Like I cannot deny that at this point in my life. I've met way more people who religion is helping than hurting, and so it's weird because like I do agree. I think the second a human starts talking about God like they know more than you, that's just crazy to me. That's like it's arrogant. It's like so. But when a human talks about like their experiences in an attempt to help you not ignore some pretty obvious signs of like ethics, in my opinion, then that's also like interesting. So I was and am very surprised to hear that you believe what you believe, which is why I love this podcast. And I can explain why. It's because
I was gonna ask.
yeah, no, I'm not gonna leave you like, hey, because you're stupid. No, because the reason I'm totally surprised is that I've met you at different points in your life, and you've never not been on the trajectory you're on, which is all about helping other people. And so like it's so obvious to me. Like I was so happy to hear about your career when we met at the wedding again. Like just could not be happier because A, it's good for the world, and B, it's good for you. It's like a symbiotic like meeting. And this is what I've noticed about like why I brought up young people. Give people until their 30s. Like let like I bartended for years and like did other things. Like I just think it's really weird. Like we shouldn't say like, hey, don't ever work and don't quote unquote grow up. But like growing up isn't working. Growing up is like figuring out what you want to do with your time, which is different than just like finding a job. So like that's why I'm phrasing it the way I am. I'm surprised that you had Catholic guilt your whole life, because that would, in my opinion, have seemed to impede you from being the actual person I've always seen you as, which is like a very open, helpful, loving person. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting.
Yeah. So like my stereotype of Catholic guilt is that it makes people less friendly and helpful to others, actually. I know that sounds weird, but that's my stereotype of it.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see where that like stereotype comes from, and I think that goes along with kind of the rigid camp of things, right? But yeah, I mean, my trajectory in terms of picking a helping profession for my life's work has a lot to do with Catholicism. So Catholicism is big on social justice and kind of putting putting your money where your mouth is, right, in terms of deeds and charity, and a little bit less about kind of proselytizing.
Yeah.
So to me, it tracks. But no, it's interesting to hear of like that stereotype being something that would inhibit the wanting to help people.
Yeah, and that's why I said I was going to put a pause on the conversation about mental illness and get in all this, is that for me, like, my solution to mental illness is like threefold. One, you need to have strong connections. Like, you can't live alone and not have a lot of friends and stuff. Like, I believe very strongly that you don't need to have a spouse and you don't need to have your own children, but you need to have spousal and child-like relationships with people, and both as like being a child to someone else and being a parent to them. So like mentoring is great. Like any of those work in my book. And then two, I think it's really important that people have some sense of meaning and purpose to like existence, even if it's I'm an atheist, there's nothing before this and nothing after this, this is my only shot, I gotta really make every day count. That counts. But like to me, that is spirituality. And so kind of on that note, do you think as you help different patients and stuff, do you think the average person would be helped with spirituality, or do you think that it's completely unimportant for everyone?
No, I think it's super important. And, like you said, it can take so many different forms, and it doesn't really matter which form it takes. But something that, like, most therapists will ask about at intake is, what is your spiritual background? How does that factor into your life? And it's definitely, I guess there's like a little bit of a sense of relief when I hear that someone does have a strong type of spirituality, because it's a big building block of resilience, and also community building, like you mentioned, which is really, really important. So yeah, I mean, I do think it's critical to having a healthy life, basically.
Wow, that's so cool, and I love the way you phrase that. That was incredible. It's just so interesting. Like, yeah, I can't imagine what it's like in intake. I can't imagine your career. I've imagined it a million times, but I can't, and it's interesting. But I just know that I am so thankful when a good person becomes a therapist or a doctor and a teacher, any job where you're interacting with a lot of people, because, um, I just think people need positive experiences with diverse groups of people to lower what I was just talking about earlier, which is like not only stereotyping, but then insisting on stereotypes being true and not checking, your logic along the way and all that. So, Bridget, you've been an amazing guest. We are up against the wall, but I always give my guests like kind of the last little chance to talk. So is there anything you'd like to leave our audience with?
Stay off social media as much as you can, I guess.
Go off on that. Talk a little more about that, please.
So I mean, I read a Wall Street Journal article maybe a year or two ago that was about how to do a dopamine detox. With basically the idea was that we're sort of flooding our brains with dopamine by scrolling all the time, scrolling really stimulating apps. So I tried it. Basically, you have to go cold turkey for 30 days. And it was pretty transformative in terms of just my own attention span, my mood, kind of the way that I exercise my creativity. So I do try to talk to people as much as I can, like my clients, right? A lot of people kind of are sick of hearing about it. They don't want to hear about it, but it is impacting everyone negatively, whether you know it or not. And I think trying to cut it out will illustrate for a lot of people just how dependent they've become.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'm definitely among the flock that you are talking to, because I did it a while ago and then I've cautiously crept back in because of career reasons. But I'm pretty good at it now, and I can tell you I'm doing pretty well. But with that said, being pretty good at it doesn't mean I've cut it out and then I'm not using it, which is also fascinating to me, because there's this like instant dopamine rush and there's an attraction to it. So that was really profound. I'm glad I got you to talk more about that, because that was definitely a great note to end this podcast on. So to everyone listening at home, Bridget Reiser does not sell anything to the masses. She does not have like a social media website type thing. So thank you so much, Bridget, for coming on the show. You're a great special person, and I'm glad that you're doing everything you are in your life. And gosh, I know this is so like sounds condescending. You're so young. You're 33. You have so many awesome years ahead of you.
Oh, thank you.
My 30s were more fun than my 20s, and my 40s are more fun than my 30s. So I can just tell you that like I think you're a similarly minded person. So look forward to what's coming. Keep helping people untangle their relationships. And if you want to help our show out, everyone, please head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up for free for the weekly email. You've been listening to Coffin Talk. My name is Mike Oppenheim. It's been an interview with Bridget Reiser, and we will see you soon. Your name and I say you are my